In the year 897 AD, inside one of the most sacred buildings in Rome, something happened that even by the standards of the medieval world was considered completely and utterly depraved. A sitting pope ordered the corpse of his predecessor to be dug out of his grave 9 months after burial. The rotting body was then dressed in full papal vestments, carried through the streets of Rome, and propped up on a throne in front of a court of bishops, cardinals, and clergy. Then the trial began. The living pope screamed accusations at the dead one. A terrified teenage deacon stood behind the corpse, tasked with speaking in its defense. The audience watched in stunned, horrified silence. And at the end of it all, the dead pope was found guilty. His vestments were torn off, 3 fingers were cut from his hand, and his body was thrown into the river. This is not a legend. This is not a myth. Every detail you are about to hear is historically documented. This is the story of the Cadaver Synod, the most insane event in the history of the Catholic Church. And almost nobody knows it happened. To understand why a dead man was put on trial, you first need to understand who that dead man was. And the truth is, Pope Formosus was not a villain. He was, by most accounts, one of the more capable and dedicated church figures of his era. He was born around 816 AD in the Papal States near Rome, into a world where the church and political power were completely inseparable. From a young age, he showed an unusual combination of theological intelligence and personal ambition, 2 qualities that in the 9th century church were equally admired and equally dangerous. By his 30s, he was already an accomplished missionary, chosen by the church and sent all the way to Bulgaria to spread Christianity across Eastern Europe. This was not a comfortable assignment. Bulgaria in the 860s was a pagan kingdom ruled by a powerful and unpredictable ruler named Boris I, and converting it to Christianity meant navigating treacherous politics, rival influences from Constantinople, and the constant threat that the entire mission could collapse overnight. Formosus did it anyway. He was extraordinarily effective. He built churches, ordained clergy, established a Christian infrastructure across an entire kingdom that had never had one. His reputation grew enormously as a result. He became one of the most celebrated church figures in all of Europe, and that success, that visibility, that reputation made him a target. By 864 AD, he had been appointed Bishop of Porto, one of the most prestigious positions in the church outside of Rome itself, and by 872 AD, his name was already being whispered as a future pope. The sitting pope at the time, John VIII, heard those whispers, and rather than seeing Formosus as an asset, he saw him as a threat. In 876 AD, John VIII had Formosus excommunicated, stripped of every title he held, and driven into exile. The charges were deliberately vague. Formosus was accused of aspiring to the papacy unlawfully, of abandoning his diocese without permission, of swearing a false oath. None of it was particularly convincing. Most historians read it plainly as what it was: a powerful man eliminating a rival before that rival could become powerful enough to eliminate him. Formosus spent years wandering in exile, cut off from the institution he had given his life to. He was eventually rehabilitated after John VIII died, restored to his position, and quietly returned to the church that had cast him out. But the experience left a mark, and the accusations made against him during that exile, vague and politically motivated as they were, never fully disappeared. They were still sitting there, buried in the record, waiting to be used again by the next person who needed a reason to destroy him. By 891 AD, after a string of popes who died in rapid succession under circumstances that were rarely natural, Formosus was elected to the papacy. He was around 75 years old. He had survived exile, excommunication, and decades of political warfare inside one of the most dangerous institutions on Earth. And now, finally, he sat at the top of it. His papacy lasted 5 years, which by the standards of the era was actually a relatively stable reign. But the world he governed was anything but stable. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what the 9th century papacy actually was. Because if you picture the Vatican as a place of quiet prayer and solemn theological debate, you are imagining a completely different institution than the one that existed in 897 AD. The papacy was not primarily a spiritual office. It was the most powerful political position in Western civilization. Whoever controlled the Pope controlled the ability to crown Holy Roman emperors, to legitimize kings, to excommunicate enemies, to elevate allies, to shift the balance of power across an entire continent. The great noble families of Rome and the ruling dynasties of Europe understood this perfectly, and they fought over it with everything they had. Between 872 and 965 AD, roughly 24 popes were appointed. Many lasted only months. Several were murdered. One pope, John VIII, the same man who had exiled Formosus, had his skull caved in by members of his own entourage after they grew impatient, waiting for the poison they had already given him to finish the job. This was the institution Formosus had spent his life climbing. And this was the world his successors would use to destroy him. The central political crisis of Formosus's papacy was a bitter power struggle between two competing claimants to the Holy Roman Empire. On one side was Lambert of Spoleto, a young ruler backed by his fiercely ambitious mother, Agiltrude, one of the most powerful and ruthless figures in Italian politics. On the other side was Arnulf of Carinthia, a Frankish king from the north with a stronger claim to the Carolingian imperial legacy. Formosus had initially worked with the Spoletan family. But as Lambert's aggression grew and Agiltrude's influence over Italian politics tightened, Formosus grew nervous. He made a decision that he almost certainly knew was dangerous. He sent secret word to Arnulf inviting him to invade Italy and receive the imperial crown directly from Rome. It was a direct move against Lambert, a declaration, in everything but name, of whose side Formosus was on. In 896, Arnulf crossed the Alps with his army, marched on Rome, and Formosus crowned him Holy Roman Emperor. Lambert was undermined, the Spoletan dynasty was humiliated, and Formosus had made enemies that were not the forgiving kind. Weeks after the coronation, Formosus was dead. He died on April 4, 896. The cause of his death remains unclear. He was buried with full papal honors in St. Peter's Basilica, and Lambert of Spoleto and his mother Agiltrude rode into Rome. His immediate successor was Pope Boniface VI. He lasted 11 days. He was almost certainly poisoned. Then came Pope Stephen VI, a man whose personal history with Formosus ran deep and whose mental stability, by the accounts of every chronicler who documented his reign, was somewhere between fragile and non-existent. Years earlier, Formosus had personally ordained Stephen as a bishop, but had also raised doubts about whether that ordination was canonically valid, given Stephen's troubled past within the church. That slight, real or perceived, had festered in Stephen for years. And now Stephen was pope, elevated with the support of the Spoletan family, who despised Formosus for what he had done to Lambert, and he found himself holding absolute power with an old score to settle and powerful backers who wanted the same thing he did. Contemporary chroniclers describe Stephen as a man prone to violent outbursts, consumed by paranoia, and obsessed with the legacy of his predecessor in a way that went far beyond political calculation. Historians still debate whether he was clinically unwell or simply ruthless. What is not debated is what he did next. Around January of 897, 9 months after Formosus had been buried, Stephen gave the order. The tomb was opened, the body was removed, and the preparations for the most grotesque legal proceeding in the history of Christianity began. The event took place in the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the official cathedral of the Bishop of Rome, and one of the 4 great basilicas of the Catholic Church. A building of immense sacred significance, chosen deliberately. The corpse of Formosus, 9 months dead, was dressed in full papal vestments. Everything a living pope would wear on the most formal occasion of the church calendar. It was carried in and propped up on a throne at the front of the court. The body had been in the ground since April. Whatever condition you are imagining right now, it was worse. The room filled with bishops, clergy, and officials, none of whom were there by choice. Refusing a papal summons in the 9th century was not a realistic option. A young deacon, described in some accounts as a teenager, was appointed to stand beside the corpse and speak in its defense. According to Liutprand of Cremona, the historian who documented the trial in the most detail, the deacon was visibly terrified. He crouched behind the body. He offered only the most minimal responses. He understood, as everyone in that room understood, that this trial had only one possible outcome, and that vigorous defense of the accused was not going to be received well by the man running the proceedings. Then Stephen VI began. He screamed at the corpse. He accused Formosus of perjury, of illegally transferring himself from the Diocese of Porto to become Bishop of Rome in violation of church canon law, of coveting the papacy for decades before he received it, of ordaining priests and bishops while still technically classified as a layman, which, if true, would have rendered every single ordination he ever performed completely invalid, throwing the legitimacy of hundreds of clergy members across Europe into immediate doubt. At one documented moment, Stephen leaned directly toward the decomposing body and shouted at it, "When you were Bishop of Porto, why did you usurp the universal Roman See in such a spirit of ambition?" The corpse said nothing. The deacon said almost nothing. The assembled clergy sat in silence, watching a living pope hold a screaming argument with a dead one. And then, according to the Annales Alemannici, a contemporary chronicle that recorded the events of that year, something happened that nobody in the room had planned for. An earthquake struck Rome. The basilica shook. Part of the structure cracked and partially collapsed around them. Every person in that room must have felt, in that moment, that the earth itself was reacting to what was happening inside it. Stephen VI did not stop. He looked at the crumbling walls and continued the trial. The verdict, of course, had been decided before the body was even carried through the door. Formosus was found guilty on every charge. His papacy was declared retroactively null and void. Every ordination he had ever performed, every appointment, every official act of his entire reign was annulled in a single declaration. Then came the punishment. The papal vestments were torn from the body and dragged across the floor of the basilica. The corpse was dressed in the plain clothing of a common layman. Stephen VI then ordered that 3 fingers be cut from the right hand of Formosus, the 3 fingers he had used throughout his life and his career to give blessings, to ordain clergy, to perform the sacred gestures of his office. Removing them was a precise symbolic act, the physical erasure of his spiritual authority. According to the Annales Alemannici, blood was still flowing from the mouth of the corpse as it was dragged across the basilica floor. Whether that detail is accurate or an embellishment added by chroniclers is debated. What is not debated is what happened next. The body of Formosus was carried out of the basilica and thrown into the Tiber River, the same river into which ancient Rome had disposed of its most condemned criminals, traitors, enemies of the emperor, the bodies of the reviled and the damned. The people of Rome had watched all of it, and they had reached a limit. The reaction was immediate. Whatever Stephen VI had expected, it was not this. The Roman public rose up. A riot swept through the city. Within weeks, Stephen VI was seized, stripped of his vestments, thrown into a prison cell, and strangled to death. His reign as pope had lasted just over a year. The body of Formosus, meanwhile, had been pulled from the Tiber by fishermen not long after it was thrown in. Liutprand of Cremona wrote that as the body was carried back toward St. Peter's Basilica, statues of saints along the route bowed their heads in veneration as it passed. Whether you take that literally or not, the meaning is clear. The people of Rome had made their judgment. The dead pope was the victim. The living one was the monster. Sympathetic clergy quietly reburied the body in a monastery, while the city sorted itself out. But the legal chaos Stephen had created didn't disappear with his death. He had declared every ordination Formosus ever performed to be invalid. That meant hundreds, possibly thousands of priests and bishops across Europe technically no longer held legitimate holy orders. The entire ecclesiastical structure Formosus had built over a career spanning decades was in question. The church had a serious problem on its hands. In December of 897, Pope Theodore II convened a synod and annulled the cadaver synod entirely. Formosus was rehabilitated. His papacy was declared valid. His body was retrieved, given full funeral rites, dressed again in papal vestments, and reburied with honors in St. Peter's Basilica. The following year, Pope John IX confirmed the same conclusion in two separate synods. The cadaver synod was condemned as unlawful and an abomination. Its official records were ordered destroyed. Every surviving document from the trial was burned. It is the reason no transcript of the proceedings exists today. The Vatican buried the episode as completely as it could. And then, just when it seemed like it was finally over, it got stranger still. In 904 AD, Pope Sergius III came to power. Sergius had been in that room. He had been present at the cadaver synod and had supported Stephen VI throughout. Now, 7 years later, he reversed everything. He nullified the synods of Theodore II and John IX. He reinstated the original guilty verdict against Formosus. He ordered that every bishop and priest who had been ordained by Formosus be reordained from scratch, causing a wave of confusion and disruption that rippled through the church for years. Sergius III was not, to put it gently, operating from a position of moral authority. Contemporary sources indicate that he was almost certainly responsible for the murder of his immediate predecessor. He was also believed by chroniclers of the era to have fathered a child with a 15-year-old girl named Marozia, who would go on to become one of the most powerful political figures in Rome for the next several decades, controlling the papacy itself from behind the scenes, and eventually having one of her own sons elected pope. The man reinstating the conviction of Formosus was a murderer and a predator. His verdict was ignored then and has been universally disregarded by the Catholic Church ever since. The official position today is unambiguous. Formosus was a legitimate pope. His papacy is valid. His ordinations are recognized. And in 1,200 years since his death, not a single pope has ever taken the name Formosus. He is one of only a handful of popes in history whose name has simply never been used again. So what do we make of all this? On the surface, the cadaver synod looks like the act of a madman, and in many ways it was. But historians who have studied it closely argue it was also something more deliberate. Stephen VI needed to delegitimize everything Formosus had done. He needed to erase the crowning of Arnulf. He needed to throw the ordinations of Formosus into doubt, because many of the clergy Formosus had ordained were politically aligned with factions that threatened the Spoletan hold on power. The method was insane. The purpose was coldly rational. What it ended up doing instead was destroying Stephen himself. The spectacle was too much even for a world thoroughly accustomed to papal violence and corruption. It crossed a line that even 9th century Rome recognized as a line. And in crossing it, Stephen VI handed his enemies exactly what they needed. The Cadaver Synod is remembered today as one of the opening acts of what historians call the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age of the Papacy, a stretch of decades through most of the 10th century defined by corruption, assassination, and the complete subordination of the Church to the ambitions of powerful families. It is a chapter the Vatican has never been eager to discuss. But it happened. A dead pope in rotting vestments, propped up on a throne in a sacred basilica, while a living pope screamed at him, an earthquake cracking the walls around them, a teenage boy cowering behind a corpse, trying to speak in its defense. It all happened inside one of the holiest buildings in the world, in the name of God. And the body of Formosus is still there, beneath St. Peter's Basilica, where it has rested for 1,200 years, quietly, as it always has.